The committee hearing room fell silent as Senator Elizabeth Warren, at 75 years old, looked across the table at actor Jonathan Roumie with the kind of condescending smile that had dominated Washington for over 3 decades. What happened? In the next 30 seconds, this would become the most viral political moment of the year, leaving Warren completely exposed and Roumie standing as the unexpected victor. Warren had walked into this hearing confident, clutching her stack of papers like weapons, ready to lecture the 51-year-old actor about how things really worked in Washington. She thought her decades of experience would crush this upstart, a well-known actor with no political background. But Roumie had come prepared with something Warren never expected, the receipts that would turn the entire hearing upside down. The cameras were rolling, social media was watching, and what started as Warren's attempt to embarrass a newcomer became her own public humiliation. This wasn't just another boring committee meeting. This was the moment when old Washington arrogance met new generation preparation, and the results shocked everyone watching. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the marble walls of the hearing room. Staff members lined the walls, notebooks in hand, expecting another routine session of political theater. The press gallery was half empty. After all, this was supposed to be a standard legislative review, not the political earthquake it was about to become. Warren adjusted her reading glasses and straightened her papers, that familiar smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. She had done this dance 1,000 times before, putting younger members in their place with a combination of institutional knowledge and barely concealed contempt. Roumie sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table, watching Warren's preparations with the intensity of a chess master, studying her opening moves. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing that Warren's reputation for condescension toward younger members made this confrontation inevitable. While other representatives were checking their phones or shuffling through unrelated paperwork, Roumie's attention was laser-focused on the woman across from him. Before we dive into this incredible political showdown that had everyone talking, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these explosive political moments that are reshaping American politics. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. The tension in that room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Warren sat there in her navy blue blazer, silver hair perfectly styled, looking every bit the establishment senator she'd been for over 30 years. Her pearl necklace caught the light as she leaned forward, the picture of senatorial authority. Across from her sat Roumie, older, sharper, and completely ready for whatever Warren was about to throw at him. His dark suit was impeccable, his posture confident but respectful, the image of a professional who had nothing to prove but everything to gain. Neither woman knew that this exchange would end up trending nationwide within the hour. But the stage was set for political drama at its finest. The C-SPAN cameras hummed quietly in the corner, their red recording lights glowing like warning beacons. Social media managers from both camps sat in the gallery, phones ready to capture and disseminate. Whatever sound bites emerged from this session, the air conditioning system struggled against the heat generated by dozens of bodies packed into the ornate chamber, creating an atmosphere that felt charged with anticipation. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two figures are and what they represent in American politics today. The contrast couldn't be more striking, and that's exactly what made this moment so powerful. Senator Elizabeth Warren has been in Washington since 1993. That's over 30 years of political power. She calls herself a mom in tennis shoes, but don't let that folksy image fool you. Warren has built her entire career on the idea that experience equals effectiveness. She served on major committees, passed legislation, and positioned herself as the voice of reason and experience in the Senate. At 75, she represents everything about old Washington: the backroom deals, the seniority system, and the belief that newcomers should sit down, shut up, and learn from their betters. Warren's political persona was carefully crafted over decades of media appearances and committee hearings. She perfected the art of the knowing smile, the slight shake of the head when younger members spoke, the theatrical sighs that conveyed her supposed superior wisdom. Her office walls were lined with photos of her alongside every major political figure of the past 3 decades, a visual resume designed to intimidate and impress visitors. Staff members whispered about her legendary temper when challenged, particularly by younger women who dared question her methods or priorities. The media had long portrayed Warren as the sensible veteran, the steady hand in turbulent political times. Op-ed writers regularly praised her institutional knowledge and bipartisan relationships, though few bothered to examine what those decades of experience had actually produced in recent years. Warren had become comfortable with this reputation, using it like a shield against serious scrutiny of her actual effectiveness. Her office operated like a well-oiled machine of self-promotion. Press releases were carefully crafted to highlight her involvement in every piece of successful legislation while quietly burying or ignoring the failures. Her staff had become expert at spinning defeats as moral victories and missed opportunities as strategic patience. The result was a public image that bore little resemblance to her actual legislative record, but Warren had become so accustomed to deference that she rarely encountered anyone willing to challenge the narrative. Warren's greatest strength has always been her ability to intimidate younger politicians with her resume. She's used her 3 decades of experience like a club, beating down anyone who dares question her approach or suggest that maybe, just maybe, the old ways of doing things aren't working anymore. She's particularly harsh on young women of color who dare to speak up, often using that condescending tone that makes you feel like you're being scolded by a school principal. In committee hearings, Warren had developed a reputation for what insiders called the treatment, a combination of patronizing questions, theatrical eye-rolling, and barely concealed contempt that was designed to humiliate younger members into submission. She had perfected the art of making substantive policy questions sound naive, of making passionate advocacy seem childish, of making fresh perspectives appear foolish. It was a form of psychological warfare that had kept many potential challenges silent over the years. On the other side of this political battlefield sits Jonathan Roumie, and he couldn't be more different from Warren. At 51, Roumie is older, but his career has been focused on acting and media rather than politics. This man is used to performing, captivating audiences, and influencing people's emotions, not just with words, but with authenticity. He didn't come to Washington to play nice or follow the old rules. He came to shake things up and bring fresh ideas to a stale system. Unlike many of his colleagues who had entered politics straight from college or family connections, Jonathan Roumie had earned his way into the political arena through years of experience in the public eye. As a respected actor, he had represented characters who could not afford powerful agents, fought against personal and professional challenges, and built a reputation for being thoroughly prepared for every role he took. This background had given him a unique perspective on how politics should work. Less about maintaining relationships and protecting egos, more about achieving concrete results for real people. His approach to congressional work reflected his artistic background. Where other members relied on staff summaries and talking points, Roumie understood the importance of researching the depth of the issues. Where others accepted conventional wisdom about what was possible, he formed his own conclusions based on his own knowledge and thoroughness. Where others were content to make speeches and issue press releases, he focused on getting tangible results, pushing for real changes. Roumie represented something that terrified establishment politicians like Warren. He was sharp, prepared, and absolutely refused to be intimidated by anyone, regardless of how long they'd been in Washington. He was part of a new generation of thinkers who believed that results mattered more than seniority, and that fresh ideas could be more powerful than decades of doing the same thing over and over again. The freshman representative quickly gained a reputation among his colleagues as someone you didn't want to debate unprepared. He had an instinct for finding the weakest points in an opponent's argument and the rhetorical skills to exploit those weaknesses effectively. But more than that, he had something many Washington veterans had lost: genuine passion for the work and impatience with the games that often substituted for actual governance. The stakes of this confrontation went far beyond these two figures. This was really about two competing visions of American politics. Warren represented the old guard, the idea that experience and seniority should automatically command respect and deference. Roumie represented the new wave of politicians who believe that effectiveness and results matter more than how long you have been in office. But there was something else that made this moment so charged. Warren had been particularly condescending toward younger members of Congress, especially people of color, throughout her career. She had a reputation for pulling the "I've been here longer than you" card whenever someone challenged her, and she seemed to take special pleasure in trying to embarrass newcomers in public hearings. Roumie, on the other hand, had been quietly building a reputation as someone who did his homework. While other politicians were focused on getting on television or making headlines, Roumie was studying legislation, tracking voting records, and building the kind of detailed knowledge that would prove devastating in a confrontation like this. The hearing was supposed to be routine, just another discussion about legislative priorities. But Warren had decided to make it personal, choosing this moment to publicly lecture Roumie about experience and how things worked in Washington. She thought she could score easy points by putting this young representative in his place. What she didn't realize was that Roumie had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, and he had prepared for it like an actor preparing for the most important role of his career. The confrontation began innocently enough with routine discussion about upcoming legislation. The committee had been reviewing standard procedural matters for nearly an hour. Budget allocations, timeline adjustments, the usual bureaucratic minutiae that make up most of congressional work. Several members were visibly bored, scrolling through their phones or doodling on legal pads. The stenographer's fingers moved mechanically across her keyboard, recording words that seemed destined for the dustbin of legislative history. But Warren had been waiting for her moment, watching Roumie participate in the discussions with growing irritation. Every time the younger representative asked a pointed question or suggested a more efficient approach, Warren's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She had seen this before. Ambitious newcomers who thought they could waltz into Congress and immediately improve on systems that had been refined over decades. It was time to put this particular upstart in his place. Warren leaned forward in her chair, that familiar, condescending smile spreading across her face as she prepared to deliver what she thought would be a knockout punch. Her gold-rimmed reading glasses caught the light as she tilted her head, adopting the pose of a patient teacher about to correct an errant student. "Representative Roumie," she began, her voice dripping with the kind of fake sweetness that every woman recognizes as an incoming attack. "I think it's important for newer members to understand how legislation actually works in this body." The room shifted. You could feel the energy change as everyone realized Warren was about to make this personal. Roumie sat perfectly still, his expression neutral, but you could see in his eyes that he knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't going to be a policy discussion. This was going to be a lecture. And Warren was positioning herself as the teacher talking down to a student. "You see," Warren continued, clearly enjoying herself, "when you've been in Congress for just a couple of years, it's easy to think you understand the complexities of federal legislation. But those of us who have been here for decades, and I've been serving the people of Massachusetts for over 30 years, we know that good intentions aren't enough. You need experience. You need relationships. You need to understand how the system actually works." The condescension was so thick you could practically see it. Warren was speaking slowly, deliberately, as if she were explaining basic concepts to a child. Several other committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the tone and knowing that Warren was about to try to humiliate Roumie in front of the cameras. But Roumie didn't flinch. He didn't interrupt. He just sat there, taking notes, letting Warren dig her own grave with every word. And Warren, drunk on her own sense of superiority, kept digging. "I've passed major legislation that has helped millions of Americans," Warren went on, her voice getting more patronizing with each sentence. "I've worked with presidents from both parties. I've built the relationships that actually get things done in this town. And I have to say, Representative Roumie, that some of your recent statements suggest you might benefit from understanding how experienced legislators approach these complex issues." The insult was clear, even though Warren wrapped it in political speak. She was basically calling Roumie naive, inexperienced, and out of his depth. It was the kind of power play that Warren had used successfully for years to keep younger politicians in line. The problem was, she had picked the wrong target this time. Roumie looked up from his notes, and for just a moment, you could see a flash of something in his eyes. Not anger, something much more dangerous. It was the look of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Someone who had prepared for this confrontation more thoroughly than Warren could have imagined. "Senator Warren," Roumie said, his voice calm and steady, "I appreciate your perspective on experience and effectiveness in Congress. Since you've raised the topic, I think it would be valuable to examine the actual record and see what all that experience has produced." She had expected to deliver her lecture, watch Roumie squirm, and then move on with her authority firmly established. Instead, Roumie was suggesting they actually examine the record, something Warren definitely hadn't prepared for. Other committee members were now paying close attention. The staff members lining the walls had stopped their quiet conversations and were focused on this exchange. Everyone could sense that something bigger was about to happen. Warren tried to regain control. "Well, Representative Roumie, I think my record speaks for itself. 30 years of service, countless pieces of legislation, working across the aisle to get things done. That's what experience looks like." But Roumie was ready for that response too. He had his own stack of papers now, flipping through them with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. Actually, Senator Warren, since you've made experience and effectiveness the issue here, I think it would be helpful to look at some specific examples. I've done some research on your legislative record, particularly in recent years, and I think the committee might find the results interesting. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Warren's confident expression was completely gone now, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. She had opened this door by lecturing Roumie about experience and effectiveness, but she clearly hadn't expected anyone to actually examine her record in detail. Roumie had turned the tables completely. Instead of defending himself against Warren's condescending lecture, he had shifted the entire conversation to focus on results and effectiveness, exactly the area where Warren was most vulnerable. The experienced senator had walked straight into a trap set by the supposedly inexperienced representative, and everyone in the room could see it happening in real time. What happened next would go down as one of the most devastating political takedowns in recent memory. Roumie had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and it showed in every calculated word that came out of his mouth. The transformation in Roumie was immediate and striking. Gone was the respectful freshman representative who had been quietly taking notes throughout the hearing. In his place sat a seasoned actor who had just been handed the perfect opening by an overconfident opponent. His posture straightened, his eyes sharpened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had done his homework better than anyone else in the room. The other committee members sensed the shift immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, phones were lowered, and suddenly everyone was paying attention. Even the staff members along the walls stopped their quiet shuffling and focused on the table where two very different visions of political power were about to clash in the most public way possible. Warren, still basking in what she assumed was her successful lecture, didn't recognize the danger she was in. She adjusted her reading glasses and prepared to continue her condescending monologue, completely unaware that she had just walked into a carefully constructed trap. The slight smile on her face suggested she thought she had already won this exchange, that her display of senatorial authority had put the younger Roumie firmly in his place. But Roumie's training had taught him that the most devastating attacks often came not from anger or emotion, but from cold, hard facts presented with surgical precision. He had studied Warren's record for weeks, not out of personal animosity, but because he knew this confrontation was inevitable. Warren's reputation for dismissing younger members was well known, and Roumie had prepared for this moment like an actor preparing for the most important role of his career. "Senator Warren," Roumie began, his voice still perfectly calm, but now carrying an edge that made everyone in the room lean forward. "Since you've raised the issue of experience and effectiveness, let's talk about your recent legislative record. I think it's particularly relevant given your criticism of newer members." Warren tried to interrupt, sensing danger. "Representative Roumie, I don't think..." But Roumie wasn't having it. "Oh, I think this is exactly what we should be discussing," he shot back. "You've spent the last 10 minutes lecturing me about experience and how the system works. So let's examine what your 3 decades of experience have actually produced recently." The first blow came swift and precise. Let's start with the affordable housing initiative you championed last year. You held press conferences, you talked about your experience in housing policy, and you criticized younger members for not understanding the complexities. That bill died in committee without a single Republican vote despite your claims about being able to work across the aisle. Warren's face went pale. That housing bill had been one of her signature initiatives, something she had promoted heavily in the media. Its failure had been quietly buried in the news cycle, but Roumie had clearly done his homework. "But that's just one example," Roumie continued, flipping through his papers with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Let's talk about the Infrastructure Enhancement Act you co-sponsored in 2022. You appeared on multiple talk shows discussing your decades of experience with infrastructure issues. That bill also failed to gain any meaningful Republican support, despite your relationships and experience." The room was dead silent now. Even the staff members had stopped moving. Everyone could see that Roumie had come prepared for war, and Warren was completely caught off guard. "And then there's the education funding reform bill from 2021, Roumie went on, his voice gaining strength with each revelation. "You held a press conference specifically to criticize younger members who you said didn't understand how education policy really worked. You talked about your 30 years of experience. That bill never even made it to a floor vote." Warren was visibly struggling now. Her hands were shaking slightly as she shuffled through her own papers, clearly trying to find some way to respond. But Roumie had done something Warren never expected. He had turned Warren's own weapon against her. All that talk about experience and effectiveness was now being used to highlight Warren's recent failures. But Roumie wasn't done. He had saved the best for last. Senator Warren, he said, pausing for effect, in the last 3 years, while you've been lecturing newer members about experience and effectiveness, you've sponsored or co-sponsored 17 major pieces of legislation. Would you like to know how many of those became law? The question hung in the air like a sword about to fall. Warren knew the answer, and from the look on her face, it wasn't good. 3, Roumie said, letting the number sink in. 3 out of 17, that's less than an 18% success rate. And of those 3 that did become law, 2 were minor procedural changes, and 1 was a bill renaming a post office. The impact was immediate and devastating. Warren's entire argument about experience and effectiveness had just been completely destroyed by her own legislative record. She had spent 30 years in Congress, but her recent record showed almost no meaningful legislative accomplishments, despite her claims about understanding how the system worked. But here's what's really interesting, Roumie continued, his eyes sharp as he prepared to deliver the knockout punch. During that same 3-year period, the so-called inexperienced freshman class, the members you've been lecturing about not understanding how things work, has actually passed more meaningful legislation per capita than the senior members. Warren tried desperately to respond. Representative Roumie, you're taking these numbers out of context. Am I? Roumie shot back, and now the calm facade was gone, replaced by the fierce energy of a trial lawyer going in for the kill. Because I have the context right here. Your housing bill failed because you didn't do the groundwork with the Republican members. Your infrastructure bill failed because you assumed your seniority would carry the day instead of building actual bipartisan support. Your education bill never got a vote because you were too busy giving interviews about your experience instead of doing the hard work of counting votes and building coalitions. The room was electric. Now, this wasn't just a policy disagreement. This was a complete dismantling of everything Warren represented. Her experience, her effectiveness, her understanding of how the system worked. All of it was being systematically destroyed in front of a live audience. You want to lecture me about how things work in Washington? Roumie was standing now, his voice carrying across the room. Let me tell you how they actually work. They work when you do your homework instead of relying on your reputation. They work when you build real relationships instead of expecting deference. They work when you focus on results instead of lectures. Warren was completely silent now, her face red with embarrassment and anger. She had started this confrontation expecting to humiliate a younger colleague, but instead she was being systematically destroyed by her own record. But Roumie wasn't finished. He had one more devastating blow to deliver. Senator Warren, you've spent this entire hearing talking about your 30 years of experience as if it automatically makes you more effective. But experience without results isn't experience, or it's just time served. And based on your recent record, maybe it's time to consider that fresh perspectives and new approaches might actually be more effective than 3 decades of the same failed strategies. The words hit Warren like physical blows. Her entire identity, her whole sense of authority, was built on the idea that her experience made her superior to younger members. Roumie had just argued convincingly that Warren's experience was actually a liability, that she had become so stuck in old patterns that she could no longer adapt to get results. The hearing room erupted. Staff members were frantically taking notes. Other committee members were whispering among themselves. And you could practically hear the phones buzzing as word of this confrontation started to spread. Warren sat there in stunned silence, completely unprepared for the systematic destruction of her reputation that had just occurred. The immediate aftermath of Roumie's systematic destruction of Warren was unlike anything anyone in that hearing room had ever witnessed. Within minutes of the exchange ending, phones were buzzing, social media was exploding, and the political world was trying to process what they had just seen. Warren sat in stunned silence for several long moments after Roumie finished speaking. The woman who had walked into this hearing confident in her authority and ready to lecture a younger colleague was now facing the complete collapse of her carefully constructed image. Her hands were visibly shaking as she tried to shuffle through her papers, looking for some way to respond to what had just happened. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Representative Roumie," she began, then stopped, clearly struggling to find words. My record speaks for itself. 30 years of public service." But even Warren seemed to realize how hollow those words sounded. Now, Roumie had just proven that Warren's 30 years of service had recently produced almost nothing meaningful. And everyone in the room knew what. The comfortable authority that Warren had wielded for decades was gone, shattered by a younger man who had simply done his homework. The committee chair, clearly recognizing that this situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control, quickly called for a recess, but the damage was already done. As the hearing broke up, you could see clusters of people huddled around phones already sharing clips and highlights from what they had just witnessed. Within 30 minutes of the hearing's end, social media exploded with clips of the confrontation. The hashtag #RoumieSchoolsWarren was trending on multiple platforms, with thousands of users sharing the moment when Roumie revealed Warren's dismal 18% success rate. The video of Warren's stunned silence after being confronted with her own failures was shared tens of thousands of times in the first hour alone. Conservative outlets immediately jumped on the story, not because they particularly supported Roumie's politics, but because the image of an establishment Democrat being destroyed by facts and data was too good to pass up. Liberal outlets were more conflicted. They couldn't defend Warren's record, but they also weren't comfortable celebrating her public humiliation at the hands of a younger member of their own party. The reaction from other members of Congress was swift and revealing. Younger Democrats, particularly members of Roumie's freshman class, were privately celebrating. For years, they had endured condescending lectures from senior members like Warren about their supposed inexperience and naivety. Seeing one of their own turn the tables so decisively was incredibly satisfying. But senior Democrats were panicking. Warren's humiliation wasn't just about one senator. It was about the entire seniority system that kept older members in power. If younger members could successfully challenge senior members by simply pointing to their records, the whole power structure of Congress could be threatened. Representative Johnson, a sophomore Democrat from California, tweeted within hours, "Today proved that preparation beats seniority every time. Maybe it's time we focused more on results and less on how long someone has warmed their seat." That tweet was shared over 50,000 times in the first day, showing how much pent-up frustration there was among younger members about the way they had been treated by the old guard. The media coverage was extensive and brutal for Warren. Political shows spent hours dissecting the exchange, with most analysts concluding that Roumie had completely outmaneuvered his senior colleague. Even traditionally friendly outlets were forced to acknowledge that Warren's recent legislative record was far weaker than her public image suggested. A prominent political analyst on a major network summed it up perfectly. What we witnessed today wasn't just a policy disagreement. This was a complete dismantling of the idea that seniority automatically equals effectiveness. Jonathan Roumie came prepared with facts, figures, and a devastating argument that experience without results is meaningless. Warren looked like she had never considered that someone might actually examine her record in detail. But the most damaging coverage came from investigative reporters who began digging deeper into Warren's recent legislative history. What they found confirmed everything Roumie had said, and worse. Not only was Warren's recent success rate abysmal, but her staff had been actively trying to hide or downplay her failures while promoting her supposed expertise and experience. One particularly damaging report revealed that Warren's office had issued press releases claiming credit for legislation that she had actually opposed or had minimal involvement in. Another showed that her bipartisan relationships were mostly photo opportunities with no real policy substance behind them. The political implications were enormous and far-reaching. Warren's humiliation sent shockwaves through the established order of Congress, particularly among senior Democrats who had built their authority on similar claims about experience and effectiveness. Within a week, 3 other senior Democrats found themselves facing uncomfortable questions about their own legislative records. The experience equals effectiveness argument that had protected older members from serious scrutiny was now completely undermined. Younger members across the party suddenly felt empowered to challenge their seniors in ways that had been unthinkable before. The impact on Warren personally was swift and brutal. Committee chairs began questioning whether she should continue in leadership roles. Donors started asking uncomfortable questions about her effectiveness. Most damaging of all, several potential primary challengers began making inquiries about running against her in the next election. Sensing that her aura of invincibility had been shattered, Warren tried desperately to control the damage. She gave several interviews attempting to explain her record and defend her effectiveness, but every appearance only made things worse. When pressed on her 18% success rate, she became defensive and angry, confirming the image of an out-of-touch senior member who expected deference rather than results. Her worst moment came during a television interview when she was asked directly about Roumie's challenge to her effectiveness. "Representative Roumie is a smart young man," Warren said, but he doesn't understand the complexities of what we do here. Sometimes the most important work happens behind the scenes. The interviewer pressed back. But Senator, he presented specific data about your legislative failures. How do you respond to the charge that your experience hasn't translated into effective results? Warren's response was a disaster. I don't think it's appropriate for junior members to be questioning senior members like this. There's a way things are done in Congress, and this kind of grandstanding doesn't help anyone. The clip went viral within hours, with thousands of users pointing out that Warren's response perfectly illustrated Roumie's point about senior members expecting deference rather than delivering results. For Roumie, the aftermath was transformational. Overnight, he went from being seen as a promising but relatively unknown freshman to being viewed as a rising star with the potential to reshape Democratic politics. His careful preparation, strategic thinking, and devastating execution of the confrontation marked him as someone to watch. Democratic fundraising groups that had never paid attention to him before were suddenly reaching out. Speaking invitations poured in from across the country. Most importantly, other freshman Democrats began looking to him for leadership on how to deal with condescending treatment from senior members. But Roumie was smart enough to know that his victory over Warren was just the beginning. In interviews after the confrontation, he was gracious but firm about the larger implications. This was never about Senator Warren personally. He said in a statement that was widely praised for its political sophistication, "This was about whether we're going to be satisfied with business as usual or whether we're going to demand actual results for the people who sent us here. Experience is valuable, but only when it produces meaningful outcomes. The American people deserve better than lectures about how things have always been done." The confrontation also had broader implications for American politics. It demonstrated that the old rules about deference to seniority were breaking down, replaced by a new dynamic where effectiveness and results mattered more than time served. This shift terrified establishment politicians in both parties who had built their careers on the assumption that seniority provided protection from serious challenge. Conservative commentators, despite disagreeing with both politicians' ideologies, couldn't help but admire Roumie's tactical brilliance. Liberal commentators were forced to confront uncomfortable questions about whether their own reverence for experience and seniority was preventing the party from being more effective. The most insightful analysis came from a veteran political reporter who wrote, "What Jonathan Roumie did to Elizabeth Warren wasn't just political theater, it was a demonstration of how politics is changing in America. The old assumptions about age, experience, and authority are being challenged by a new generation that values preparation, results, and accountability over deference to seniority." Warren's humiliation wasn't just personal, it was symbolic of a larger shift in how political power is earned and maintained. 3 months after the confrontation, the political landscape looked fundamentally different. Warren announced she would not seek re-election, citing a desire to spend more time with family, the traditional political excuse for someone whose career had been effectively ended. 2 other senior Democrats announced similar decisions, clearly recognizing that the old rules no longer applied. Roumie, meanwhile, was selected for several high-profile committee assignments typically reserved for more senior members. His rise was meteoric, and it was built entirely on the foundation of that one devastating confrontation, where he proved that preparation and results could triumph over seniority and assumptions. The lesson for American politics was clear in the new political environment. Respect had to be earned through effectiveness, not assumed through seniority. The era of unquestioned deference to experience was over, replaced by a more demanding standard where actual results mattered more than time served. As one political commentator put it, Jonathan Roumie didn't just destroy Elizabeth Warren that day, he destroyed the entire myth that longevity in office automatically equals effectiveness. In doing so, he may have changed American politics forever. The story of Warren's attempted lecture turning into her own public humiliation became a textbook case study in political miscalculation. It showed what happened when established politicians assumed they could coast on their reputations instead of focusing on their actual performance. More importantly, it demonstrated that the new generation of politicians wasn't going to be intimidated by condescension or impressed by seniority alone. For anyone watching American politics, the message was unmistakable. The old rules were changing, and those who couldn't adapt would find themselves on the wrong side of viral moments that could end careers in an instant. Warren had learned that lesson the hard way, and her political obituary was written not by voters or opponents, but by a younger colleague who had simply done his homework better than she had done hers. The confrontation between Elizabeth Warren and Jonathan Roumie will be remembered as one of those moments that perfectly captured a shift in American politics. The moment when deference to seniority died and was replaced by demands for actual results. And it all started with an older politician's assumption that she could lecture a younger colleague, only to discover that the student had become the teacher. What an incredible political showdown we just witnessed. Jonathan Roumie's preparation and precision completely dismantled Elizabeth Warren's decades of experience, proving once again that results matter more than tenure. This moment will go down in history as a turning point in American politics, where fresh perspectives trumped seniority. If you enjoyed this explosive confrontation and want to see more of these groundbreaking political moments, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss out on the latest political drama that's reshaping our world. Subscribe now and stay tuned for more.